The night nurse on the memory ward at Harlan County Regional did not look up when the door opened. She was used to the door opening. Families came at all hours in a place like this, or they did not come at all, and she had long ago trained herself not to read too much into either. She heard boots on the linoleum, heavier than most visitors wore, and she heard the low sound a large dog makes when it is breathing calmly in an unfamiliar room, and she finally looked up. The man standing at the nursing station was broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of years of real physical work, not gym work, and he had the kind of stillness about him that did not come from peace. He was 39, maybe 40, with a face weathered past its age, jaw dark with several days of growth, hair cut close and going gray at the temples. His eyes were light brown, almost amber, and they moved across the room the way a person scans a room when they have spent years in places where a wrong door meant something permanent. A German shepherd sat at his left heel, tan and black, with a broad chest and ears that tracked every sound in the ward before the man's eyes did. He set a worn canvas duffel on the floor beside him, unhurried, and looked at the nurse behind the glass. "I'm here to see Dorothea Hale," he said. "If you have ever watched someone protect the wrong thing, you understand what happened next." Because the nurse had a list, and the list was her authority, and her authority said no. If this story stays with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this one depend on people who are paying attention. The nurse found the name. She read whatever was written beside it. Then she looked up at the man with the dog. "You're not on the visitor list," she said. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a photograph the size of a hand, and he set it gently on the ledge of the nurse's station and slid it through the gap. The nurse picked it up. She looked at it for a long moment, then she looked up at the man. Then she looked at the photograph again. She set it down on the counter and said nothing for several seconds. And in those seconds, 2 other nurses came to see what she was looking at, and the aide who had been restocking a supply cart at the end of the hall came to the door of the station, and every one of them went quiet. The man waited. "I'll get the charge, nurse," the first nurse said finally, and her voice had changed. His name was Garrett Voss, and he had driven 14 hours to get here. He had left Tulsa before dawn, loaded his shepherd into the cab of a truck that had 240,000 miles on it, and leaked oil in cold weather, and he had driven north through the flat middle of Oklahoma and into the green hills of eastern Kansas, and then up through Missouri, and across the river, and into the gray winter morning of southern Illinois. And he had not stopped except for gas, and to let the dog out at a rest stop outside of Cape Girardeau. And he had arrived at Harlan County Regional at 11:17 at night, with a photograph in his pocket and nothing else that he could explain quickly. The dog's name was Decker. He was 6 years old, retired from a working line kennel in Virginia that had trained dogs for the military for over 20 years. And he had the build of a dog that had been asked to do serious things. Square and muscular, roughly 85 pounds, with a classic saddle coat, black over tan, and a black muzzle that gave his face an expression of permanent gravity. He wore a plain, worn leather collar with a single brass tag. His ears were large and fully erect, and there was a small notch in the right one from something that had happened before Garrett owned him, and Garrett had never asked. Garrett had owned Decker for 3 years. He had bought him from the kennel at a discount because the dog had washed out of an advanced protection program, not for any fault in temperament, but because he had decided, at some point during training, that he preferred to be near one person rather than taking direction from a rotation of handlers. The kennel director had called it a liability. Garrett had called it a dog. He had been passing through Virginia on his way to nowhere particular when he stopped at the kennel, and he had not intended to buy a dog, and the dog had walked across the yard and sat down beside him without any instruction from anyone, and had not moved for the duration of Garrett's visit, and by the time Garrett left, the dog came with him. That was how most things in Garrett's life had happened since he got out, not chosen so much as arrived at. He had separated from the Corps 2 years before he found Decker. 12 years in, staff sergeant, 2 deployments to the same part of Afghanistan, and 1 to Djibouti, and then a training accident in North Carolina that left him with a rebuilt left shoulder, and an honorable discharge and the particular kind of quiet that follows a life organized around structure when the structure is suddenly gone. He had gone back to Tulsa, where he had grown up, because it was the only place he could think of. And he had stayed there not because it felt right, but because leaving required a destination, and he did not have one. The photograph in his pocket was of a woman and a girl. The woman was in her early 40s in the photograph, dark-haired and smiling in the way people smile when a camera appears unexpectedly. The girl was maybe 8, gap-toothed, standing in front of what appeared to be a yellow house with a covered porch and a garden that had been recently planted. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting, Garrett knew as well as his own, were 3 words and a year: Easter Sunday, 2009. The woman in the photograph was Dorothea's daughter, Nora. The girl was Nora's daughter, Priya. They were both dead. They had been dead for 4 years. Garrett had not known Nora well, not in the way people mean when they say they know someone. He had known her the way you know a person when you serve beside them, which is a kind of knowing that goes sideways into bone and stays there. She had been an intelligence analyst attached to his unit during the 2nd deployment, and she had been meticulous and clear-headed, and had a way of reading a situation before anyone else in the room had finished forming their first impression, and she had been the one who told him, 3 days before a patrol that later became the subject of an investigation he was not permitted to discuss, that something about the route felt wrong. She had been right. He had told her he owed her, and she had said he did not, and neither of them had pursued the subject because that was not the kind of people they were. After they both got out, they had stayed in a loose contact, the way people do when the thing that bound them is over, and they are both too proud to admit that they miss it. She had gone back to finish her degree, married a man named Hale, who turned out to be less than advertised, divorced him, raised Priya alone in the house with the yellow porch. The last time Garrett had spoken to her was a Thursday in November, 4 years and 7 months ago. She had called to tell him she was moving her mother into her house, that Dorothea's memory was going, and she did not feel right leaving her in a facility, and Garrett had said that was the right thing to do, and meant it. 2 weeks later, a driver who had been awake for 31 consecutive hours ran a red light at an intersection in Carbondale, and Nora and Priya were both gone before the ambulance arrived. Garrett had driven to the funeral. He had stood at the back of the church in his dress blues because it was the only suit he owned, and he had not spoken to anyone except Dorothea briefly at the graveside. She had been 71 then, white-haired and upright, holding herself together with the specific composure of a woman who had decided she would grieve in private or not at all. She had taken his hand and held it for a moment, and she had said, "Nora told me about you." He had not known what to say to that, so he had said nothing, and they had stood beside each other until the service ended. He had not seen Dorothea since that day. He had thought of her, sometimes, in the way you think of a person you know is carrying something heavier than you are and cannot help. When he heard, through a chain of people, who had served with Nora and stayed in occasional contact, that Dorothea had gone into a memory care facility in Harlan County. He had noted it and done nothing with the information for over a year. Then a message had arrived. Not from Dorothea, from a woman named Bet Sarkissian, who described herself as a social worker at Harlan County Regional, and who had found Garrett's name and contact information in a journal Dorothea kept in her nightstand under the heading People Who Should Know, and who had written to say that Dorothea had been asking for someone named Garrett, and that the staff did not know who he was, and that the woman's next of kin on file was listed as a nephew named Damon Hale, who had not responded to 2 phone calls or 1 certified letter. Garrett had read the message on a Tuesday afternoon in Tulsa, sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store with Decker in the back seat. He had read it twice. Then he had gone back into the store and bought 2 bottles of water and a bag of almonds, and he had driven home and packed the duffel, and he had been on the highway before dark. The charge nurse who came to the nursing station was a tall woman in her mid-50s named Patrice Boudreau, and she had the kind of face that had learned to deliver difficult information without flinching. And she looked at Garrett, and then at the photograph, and then at Garrett again. She has good days and bad days, Patrice said. Today was in between. She's been agitated since dinner. What's she agitated about? Patrice paused. There's been some activity on her account. Financial. The nephew has been in touch. Garrett waited. We can't discuss specifics, Patrice said. But if you're listed anywhere in her personal documents as a contact of any kind, it would be helpful to have that formalized, given the circumstances. He did not know what circumstances meant yet. Decker had shifted his weight forward at the word nephew, and Garrett had learned to pay attention to that. Dorothea's room was at the end of a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and something warmer underneath it, something like the cedar sachets his grandmother had kept in her closet. The door was partly open. Garrett knocked twice on the frame and waited. Who's there? Her voice was steady. Garrett, he said. I don't know if you remember me. A pause. I remember you, she said. Come in. She was 75 now, white-haired and small in the way aging sometimes makes people small, as though gravity is making a patient argument. She was sitting up in her bed with a book open in her lap, and she was wearing a blue cardigan over her hospital gown that someone had clearly brought from home, because it had a small embroidered patch on the pocket that said Carbondale Garden Society, in thread that had gone faded. Her face, even in the low light of the room, held the same composure he remembered from the graveside. The memory problems had not touched her eyes. They were still clear, brown, watching him with an attention that missed very little. Decker walked to the side of the bed without any instruction and sat down. His head came even with the top of the mattress. Dorothea looked at him for a moment, then reached out one hand, and the dog pressed his broad forehead into her palm and stayed there. Nora always said you had a dog, she said. I do now, Garrett said. His name's Decker. She looked at the dog, then at Garrett. You drove a long way. I did. Bet it shouldn't have bothered you. She did the right thing. Dorothea's hand moved slowly over the dog's ears. Damon has been calling, she said. He wants to be named my healthcare proxy. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she might report a weather observation. He was also asking about what happens to my savings when I go. He wanted to know if I had a will, whether I'd had it reviewed recently. Garrett looked at her. What did you tell him? I told him I hadn't seen him in 11 years, and I didn't intend to see him now. She paused. He's coming anyway. Next Friday. What does the staff say? They can't stop him from visiting. He's family. The word had no warmth in it. He's also been talking to someone at the billing office about my accounts. I don't know what he told them. My memory isn't what it was. And there are days I can't be sure what's real and what I've confused, and Damon knows that. She looked up from the dog and met Garrett's eyes directly. I'm not confused right now. I want you to understand that. I understand that, he said. I kept a list, she said, in my journal, of people I could trust to do something, in case I couldn't. She looked at the nightstand. Bet found it. I know. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. The dog had lowered his head to the edge of the mattress and closed his eyes, and the room was warm in the particular way hospital rooms are warm, air held too close for too long. I have a lawyer, Dorothea said. Her name is Sandra. She drew up my will and my advance directive 3 years ago. Damon doesn't know about her. He thinks I haven't had any legal work done since Carl died. Carl Hale, Garrett recalled, had been Dorothea's husband, who had passed 7 years ago. I need someone to call Sandra before Friday, to make sure everything is properly recorded, and that I haven't, without knowing it, signed anything I didn't mean to sign. Garrett looked at her. Have you signed anything recently? I don't know, she said. And for the first time there was something under the composure. Not fear exactly, but the shadow of it. The awareness of a blind spot she could not fully see around. That's what I don't know. There are days I can't be certain. He stayed 3 hours that night. He sat in the chair beside the window while Dorothea dozed, and Decker lay on the floor between them, and the ward settled into its particular nighttime sounds, the beeping of equipment down the hall, the soft footfall of nurses making rounds, the distant sound of a television someone had left on in another room. In the morning, he asked Patrice to connect him with Bet Sarkisian. Bet was a compact woman in her early 40s with dark reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the kind of directness that came from working in an institution long enough to have seen every variety of family dynamics. She closed her office door when Garrett sat down. She hasn't signed anything that I can verify, Bet said. But there was a visit 3 weeks ago. A man named Damon came in with a document he said was a power of attorney update. The nurse on duty that morning said Dorothea seemed confused, and she told him to come back on a better day, which he did not seem happy about. She paused. He's been in contact with the billing administrator and with someone from the business office about estate planning resources. That's all I can say. That's plenty, Garrett said. Bet looked at him steadily. The legal standard for capacity is particular. If she has a good day and someone presents her with a document and she signs it, that may be very hard to undo. That's why I'm here, Garrett said. He found a room at a motel 6 blocks from the hospital, the kind of place that accepted dogs and did not ask questions, and he set up his laptop on the scratched desk by the window and spent 2 hours finding the office number for Dorothea's attorney, and then reaching her by phone the following morning. Sandra Chow was 53, thorough, and clearly already aware that something was moving around the edges of her client's situation. She had received a certified letter from a law office in St. Louis representing him, she said, requesting a copy of Dorothea's most recent estate documents, and she had declined to provide them. He can't force that, Garrett asked. Not without a court order, she said. And he'd need to establish that he has standing, which he doesn't currently. What concerns me is if he can get her to sign a new document before I can formalize a durable power of attorney for someone she actually trusts. What would that take? A principal, Sandra said. Someone Dorothea designates. Someone she trusts completely. And a visit from me before Friday. There was a silence. She put your name in that journal, Sandra said carefully. Garrett looked at Decker, who was stretched out on the motel floor in a bar of thin winter sunlight coming through the curtain gap. The dog's ears moved once, then settled. Tell me what she'd need to agree to, Garrett said. Sandra drove from Carbondale on Thursday. She was a small, precise woman with silver hair cut short and a briefcase that looked like it had been carried into serious rooms for many years. She met Garrett in the hospital lobby, and they walked to Dorothea's room together, and Dorothea looked at Sandra and then at Garrett and said, I suppose this is the part where we do things properly. That's the part, Sandra said. It took 2 hours. Dorothea's cognition that morning was clear and precise, and she answered Sandra's standardized assessment questions with a dryness that made even Sandra smile. And she said that she wished to name Garrett as her health care proxy and her durable power of attorney for financial matters in the event she could not act for herself, and that she wished her existing will to stand without modification. She signed her name with the pen Sandra produced, and Sandra and Patrice witnessed it. And when it was done, Dorothea looked at the papers for a moment, and then looked at Garrett. I'm not asking you to stay, she said. I know you have your own life. He did not have an answer for that, so he said nothing. Decker stood up from the corner and walked to the bed and sat down beside it. Friday came cold and gray, with a low sky that pressed down over the parking lot of Harlan County Regional, and a wind that carried the specific sting of early winter in southern Illinois. Garrett arrived at 8 in the morning and took a chair in the family waiting area near the entrance of the memory ward, where he had a clear line of sight to the elevator. Damon Hale arrived at 10:40. He was 47 years old, heavy through the middle in a way that made his sport coat pull at the buttons, with thinning blonde hair combed straight back and the particular walk of a man accustomed to being greeted rather than waited for. He carried a briefcase that matched his shoes in a way that was probably deliberate, and he was accompanied by a younger man in a cheaper suit who carried a folder of papers and never spoke unless Damon spoke to him first. Garrett watched them cross the lobby. Decker sat at his heel and watched with him. They rode the elevator up. Garrett took the stairs. He reached the nursing station ahead of them. Patrice Boudreau was at the desk. She saw Garrett and gave a small nod. When the elevator opened and Damon stepped out, Patrice was already standing. Mr. Hale, she said. Damon looked past her toward the corridor. I'm here to see my aunt. I understand. I need to ask you to stop at the station first. She kept her voice neutral, professional. There have been some changes to your aunt's legal representation and medical directives that I need to make you aware of before you visit. Damon looked at her with the expression of a man who had been managing other people's processes for years and had no patience for inconvenience. I have a right to visit family. You do, Patrice said. This is about what you may not do during that visit, and about the legal documentation we've received from your aunt's attorney of record. Damon's eyes moved past Patrice and found Garrett, who had stepped forward from where he had been standing. He looked at Garrett and then at the dog. Who are you? He said. Garrett Voss, Garrett said. I'm Mrs. Hale's designated health care proxy and her power of attorney for financial matters. Those designations were executed and witnessed yesterday by her attorney, Sandra Chow, who has already served your attorney's office with copies. If you have questions about the scope of that authority, your attorney has Mrs. Chow's contact information. Damon stared at him. The younger man with the folder looked at the folder. That document, Damon said slowly, may not hold. She has dementia. Her capacity is in question. Her capacity was assessed by her attorney of record during the execution of the document, Garrett said. On a day when the charge nurse on this ward will testify that Mrs. Hale was fully oriented. If you want to challenge that in court, you are welcome to try. He paused. Her attorney will be happy to discuss the standard of proof required. Damon looked at him for a long moment. Decker, at Garrett's heel, had not moved and had not looked away from Damon since the elevator opened. He was not growling. He was simply watching, with the complete and unhurried attention of an animal that has made an assessment and is waiting for the situation to confirm it. "I'd like to see her," Damon said, and the polish in his voice had gone somewhere. "You can see her," Garrett said. "You cannot bring documents for her to sign. You cannot discuss her finances, her estate, or her legal representation. If you attempt to do any of those things, the staff has been instructed to ask you to leave, and I will be present during the visit." He said it without heat. "Those are the terms." Damon looked at Garrett. He looked at the ward behind him, the nurses who had found reasons to be near the station. He looked at the folder in his assistant's hand, which had not been opened and would not be opened today. "This isn't over," Damon said. "That's fine," Garrett said. Damon visited for 22 minutes. He sat in the chair beside Dorothea's bed and spoke to her in the careful, measured tones of a person who knows they are being watched. And Dorothea listened and responded to his questions about her health and her comfort with the same composed courtesy she might extend to any stranger. And when he left, she did not watch him go. After the elevator doors closed, Patrice walked to Dorothea's room. Garrett was already there. "He'll hire someone to contest it," Dorothea said. She was not alarmed. She was simply accurate. "Probably," Garrett said. "Can they?" "Sandra says the documentation is solid. Good day, credible witnesses, standard assessment. He'd be filing against a clear record." Dorothea looked at the window. The sky outside was the color of old pewter. A few dry snowflakes moved across the glass without conviction. "He was never unkind to me," she said. "He was just never interested in me either. Not until Carl died, and there was something to be interested in." She was quiet a moment. "I'm more tired of people like that than I am of being old. And that's saying something." Garrett almost smiled. He had planned to leave Saturday morning. He had the motel paid through Friday, and his truck was packed. And Decker had not been off-leash on grass since Cape Girardeau, and there were no obligations holding him to Harlan County that a phone could not cover. He was sitting in the motel parking lot on Friday evening, eating a sandwich from the gas station across the street, when his phone rang. It was a number he did not recognize, local area code. He answered. "This is Earl Tremblay," the voice said. "I'm the facilities manager at the hospital. Patrice gave me your number. I hope that's all right." "It's all right," Garrett said. "I live over on Whitfield Road," Earl said. "About 2 miles from here. I have a house that's been empty since August. My wife and I moved to the daughter's place in Paducah after her surgery, and I haven't been able to do anything with the Whitfield house since then. It needs some work. Gutters mainly, and one of the back windows is not sealing right, and I've been paying to heat the outside." He stopped. "Patrice said you were in a motel." "I am," Garrett said. "I'm not asking you to fix it," Earl said quickly. "I'd pay for the materials. I just thought, if you were going to be around a while, it might be a better situation than a motel. For the dog and for you." Garrett looked at Decker, who was in the back seat and had lifted his head at the sound of the phone. How long have you been trying to find someone to look at those gutters? Garrett asked. There was a pause. Since August, Earl admitted. Garrett moved into the Whitfield Roadhouse on Saturday. It was a small frame house, pale yellow with green shutters, and the gutters were indeed in bad shape, pulled away from the fascia on the north side and holding debris that had started to compact into something close to soil. The back window was a straightforward seal failure, easy to fix once he had the right materials. Inside, the house was clean and cold, and it smelled of the particular emptiness of a place that has been loved and then left, and Decker walked through every room with a measured thoroughness, and then lay down on the kitchen floor and went to sleep, which Garrett had learned to read as a reliable verdict. He went to the hardware store that afternoon and bought caulk and brackets and clean gutters and a new window seal kit, and the man at the counter, who had the name Dale stitched on his vest, asked him if he was the fellow who had come to help Mrs. Hale. Garrett looked at him. Small town, Dale said. Patrice's sister-in-law works here part-time. I'm just helping sort out some paperwork, Garrett said. Dale looked at him over his reading glasses. Whatever you want to call it, he said, and handed Garrett his change. The gutters took most of Sunday. It was cold work up and down the ladder in a wind that came in from the northwest and found every gap in his jacket. And Decker paced the yard below and occasionally sat and watched him with the air of a professional observer taking notes. A woman named Hazel Cross, who lived in the house directly across the street, came out with a thermos of coffee at 2 in the afternoon and stood on her porch until Garrett climbed down, and then she handed him the thermos through the fence without ceremony. Nora Hale used to visit Dorothea every few weeks before everything happened, Hazel said. We'd see her car on the street. Nice woman. She was, Garrett said. Hazel looked at him for a moment. You're staying a while? I'm not sure yet, he said. She nodded as though this were a satisfactory answer. There's a supper at the Methodist Church the first and third Thursdays, she said. It's free. They don't ask questions. He did not go the first Thursday. He went the second one, which was the third Thursday of November, and he sat at the end of a long table with Decker under his feet and ate a plate of roasted chicken and green beans and cornbread that someone had made from scratch. And the man beside him turned out to be a Korean War veteran named Frank Odom, who was 91 years old and still drove himself to church suppers and had opinions about the Chicago Bears that were specific and detailed and delivered without self-consciousness. Frank did not ask Garrett anything about himself for the first 40 minutes, which Garrett appreciated. And then Frank asked him what Branch and Garrett told him, and Frank shook his hand with the grip of a man who was 91 but not diminished, and said, You picked a good dog, and went back to his chicken. Damon filed a petition in the county probate court in early December, challenging Dorothea's capacity at the time of the power of attorney execution. Sandra filed a response, 14 pages long, with exhibits that included signed statements from the charge nurse and 2 other staff members and a copy of the capacity assessment administered during the signing. She also filed an emergency motion to appoint an independent guardian ad litem to review Damon's petition, which the court granted. The guardian ad litem was a retired circuit court judge named Harriet Blum, who visited Dorothea on 3 separate occasions over 2 weeks and spoke with Garrett twice on the phone and with Sandra in person, and who filed a report in January stating that there was no credible evidence that Dorothea had lacked capacity at the time of the relevant document's execution, and recommending that the petition be dismissed. The court dismissed the petition on the 8th of February. Garrett read Sandra's message about the dismissal sitting on the back step of the Whitfield Roadhouse with his coffee, watching Decker move through the yard in the cold morning. The grass was still frozen, brittle and silver in the light, A cardinal had found the feeder Hazel Cross, had put up in the gap in the fence between the two properties sometime in December, and it was there now, startlingly red against the gray morning. He read the message twice. Then he set his phone face down on the step and watched the dog. He had been in Harlan County for just over 4 months. He had fixed the gutters and the window seal, and also, at Earl's distant request, relayed through Patrice, a section of the back fence that had come down in a November windstorm, and a kitchen faucet that had been dripping since before the Tremblays left for Paducah. The hardware store had given him a small account. Dale always asked about Decker first and then about the Hale situation, in that order, and seemed satisfied with brief answers to both. Dorothea had good days and bad days. On her good days, she was sharp and particular and had strong opinions about hospital food that she expressed with a precision that made the cafeteria staff both defensive and secretly pleased. On her harder days, she got confused about time, not about people, which Sandra said was a meaningful distinction. She always knew who Garrett was. She had once, on a hard day, called him by her late husband's name for about 10 minutes, and then had corrected herself with a flash of irritation and said, "I know perfectly well who you are. I just couldn't get to it." He had started reading to her on his visits. Her vision made sustained reading difficult, and she had always liked being read to, she told him, ever since her mother had read to her when she was small. He brought library books and read whatever she chose, which turned out to be a somewhat eclectic mix of natural history and old mystery novels, and Decker lay on the floor and half listened while the ward went about its business around them. One afternoon in late January, she had said, without preamble, from behind the book he was reading her, Nora would have been relieved. He had stopped reading. "That you came," she said. She worried about people who had no one looking after them. She always did. A pause. "She worried about you." He did not know what to say to that. He looked at the page. "She talked about you," Dorothea said. "After you both came back. She said you were the kind of person who believed the mission was all that mattered and had forgotten to build anything else." She said it without reproach. She didn't mean it as a criticism. She meant it as a concern. She wasn't wrong, Garrett said. "No." A pause. "Neither are you, being here." The morning after the court dismissed the petition, Garrett drove to Sandra's office in Carbondale. He sat in the chair across from her desk, and she walked him through what the dismissal meant and what remained. "He could appeal," she said. "I don't expect him to. It would be expensive, and the evidentiary record is against him." She folded her hands. "He may try a different approach in the future if her condition changes significantly. That's possible." "What would we need in that case?" "Continuity," she said. "Documentation of her condition over time. A consistent presence who can provide testimony. The same things we have now continued." Garrett looked out her window at the street. There was a coffee shop across the way, and a woman was coming out with a cup in each hand, moving carefully across the ice. "I'd need to formalize some things," he said. "Such as?" "I've been living in a house that isn't mine. I've been doing repairs for cash and materials. I need something more stable if I'm going to be in one place for a while." Sandra looked at him with the expression of a person who has heard many people talk around a decision and recognizes the shape of the conversation. "Earl would like someone in that house," she said. "I happen to know that because he and his wife were my clients when they bought it. He has mentioned that whoever fixed his gutters was thorough." Garrett looked at her. "I'm just noting that these things are often less complicated than they seem," she said. He called Earl Tremblay from the parking lot. Earl was in Paducah, and his wife was doing better, and yes, he had been meaning to call. He had looked into renting the house properly, but had not gotten around to the paperwork. And if Garrett wanted to take it on month to month at something reasonable until they figured out what they were doing with it, well, it was sitting there anyway. Garrett sat in the truck for a while after he hung up. Decker was in the back seat, watching him. He drove back to Harlan County on roads that were beginning to show the first signs of thaw, a softening at the edges of the snowpack, small trickles of water crossing the pavement where the sun hit the slopes. The sky was still gray, but with a different quality to it, the particular gray of late winter that is already becoming something else. He stopped at the hospital before he went home. Dorothea was awake, sitting up with the natural history book open in her lap, and she looked up when he came in. "You look like you made a decision," she said. "I think I did," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the dog, who had come to the side of the bed and was waiting with the same patience he always brought to the rooms of people he had decided to be near. "Good," she said. And that was all. She turned a page and handed him the book. He read to her for over an hour. Outside the window, the sky slowly lightened toward afternoon, and the thin winter sun found a gap in the clouds and laid a stripe of pale gold across the floor of the ward, moving gradually from the door toward the window as the afternoon passed, until it reached the foot of Dorothea's bed and stopped there, warm on the old blue cardigan, with the faded Carbondale Garden Society patch, and she had fallen asleep in the middle of a paragraph about migratory birds and the particular constancy of their returnings, and the room was quiet, and Decker lay with his head on the floor and his eyes toward the door, and Garrett set the book on the nightstand and did not move. There are people who keep lists of those who should know, when no one else would think to call. Most of us move through the world hoping we are on someone's list without ever asking, without ever knowing for certain. What Dorothea Hale did, keeping that journal in her nightstand and writing names in it with the careful handwriting of a woman who had decided to be exact about what mattered, was not a small thing. It was a kind of faith. Not the faith that announces itself, but the quiet kind, the kind that sets a table and trusts that someone will eventually come through the door. If there is someone in your life who kept a list, whose handwriting you would recognize, who put your name somewhere as a person who should know, then you already understand what this story is about. And if you are not sure whether you are on anyone's list, that may be the most important thing you could find out today. Go find out. May God watch over you and your people, and bring someone through the right door at the right time to the ones who are waiting and could not say so.